Dear students, welcome back to Foundations of Law, and we continue with the lecture series online. So, we have had some issues in the past regarding when we can start the physical lectures in the classroom. You may have received the information that I sent in the Moodle news system as well. So, there has been some talk about restarting the classes in a physical format, but also, as I understand, a lot of students are not very happy about that, especially the bulk of the class who happen to be from Finland. And there are a lot of new restrictions also coming in soon. So let's see how that goes. Anyways, September is online, and we take a call about October when we reach that situation, when we reach that date. All right, so last time I looked at philosophy and classifications of law, spent a lot of time dealing with those aspects, and now we would be beginning the other areas of the course. So now I'll be exploring with you some of the different legal systems that exist in the world and how they are important, how they can interlink with each other, what we can learn from them, and things like that. So, of course, the main legal systems we'll be exploring are the Romano-Germanic system of law. That's what you have in Finland, Germany, Estonia, all the continental countries, France, of course, Sweden, etc. Then we'll be also looking at the common law countries and the common law system, and that would be English speaking countries mainly. And then some other regional and global legal systems. So why do we do such things? I mean, why do we need to even know all these things? Well, first of all, of course, they help to give a good historical and philosophical basis for legal research. They also help to improve your own national law or the understanding of your national laws, and they help to understand foreign people and how globalization works. Now, this could be especially relevant for you in the third year, because when you are doing your thesis on a legal topic, very often the question that arises is, what is your input into this whole work that you have done? And one way of dealing with this issue is by having a comparative analysis between the research problem that you have had in one particular jurisdiction and another possible jurisdiction. So, as we'll be looking at some of these jurisdictions and the legal systems in place, we can already see that there is a Western legal philosophy, and so that's why when you try to make a comparison between the European Union and the United States on a particular region or particular area, or particular topic of law, let's say copyright law or patentability of software or GDPR provisions regarding data protection across the Atlantic, you can always see a lot of interesting insights into how different systems work. And sometimes the goals can be quite similar, but yeah, the way you reach that system is a bit different. And so that's something we'll be exploring in the course of the next 2-3 lectures. So there are a lot of contemporary laws, and there's a lot of diversity in them. And of course, each law constitutes a system. So a different legal system would have different terminologies, maybe slightly different outlooks, maybe a different way of dealing with the changes in the law or the interpretations of the law or the implementations of the law. And so these are all factors that need to be kept in mind. And of course, when we look at these different legal systems, we can understand that there are different legal families, and so when we understand these families and the criteria that is utilized, we can then see that even if you are educated in an Estonian or Finnish or German legal system and viewpoint, you could still operate in an American system or in a common law system in the UK, simply because, well, there is a lot of interoperability because these are still nonetheless Western families and Western families of jurisprudence. And so, even though the terminologies may sound a bit different, the paths taken may sound a bit different, the understanding of how the European Commission deals with anti-competition issues and how the United States authorities deal with similar aspects. Now you can already see that there are a lot of commonalities, a lot more than you would imagine. So in the US you have antitrust, and in the EU it would be called anti-competition law, but they have broadly same outlines. And of course, when you look at different family systems, you can also see those which have completely opposite philosophical, political, or economic principles. And based on that, you can already see the profound differences that exist in those type of legal systems. For example, the Islamic legal system. So the main families we'll be looking at today and in the next lecture would be the Romano-Germanic family and the common law family. So from the notes already you can see some of the key differences that are outlined. So in the Romano-Germanic family, which is also known as civil law, now you need to be careful here. This is not the same civil law as in criminal law versus civil law that we looked at last time, but rather this is civil law in the context of the Romano-Germanic family of laws. So this is civil law versus common law. So this is some terminology that you need to get used to. So when you look at civil law as such, it's basically based on the findings of legal scholars. So it's very much driven by legal scholars. In a sense, it is mainly dealing with private law, and so that is the private relationships between individual citizens. If you remember, last time we looked at public law and private law and the differences in those two. And of course, the Romano-Germanic family, the civil law system, has a lot of emphasis on codes and codification. Now compare this or contrast this with the common law family, and already you can see that common law was primarily formed by judges, and it is more about procedure, and of course it is linked to royal power. So I'll talk a bit more about that in the next lecture. But don't make a mistake, this both of them are the same arms of the Western law family, and so there may be differences, but the differences are less profound than the commonalities and the similarities. They both, whether it's the Romano-Germanic system of law or the common law system, they both lay a lot of prominence to individuality and liberalism, and of course personal rights. We also call them human rights. And so the answers can be very, very similar. So don't think that there are too many profound differences between these two. Yes, there are some different approaches or thought processes, but the end results are more or less always the same. This should be contrasted with other families, legal families, where the emphasis may be more on model of ideal behavior patterns within a society or reconciliation rather than retribution. And so when we look at, for example, in Islamic law, you often have a system where it's known as blood money. So let's say X kills Y, and now X is to be punished for this offense. It is possible that Y's family could pardon X. And of course, in return for this, X may have to pay compensation to Y's family. And this can, of course, seem very awkward or indifferent to some of us. But the point here is that in this sort of a legal system, they don't see the essence of continuing with these sort of blood feuds and killing people, or the state interfering and trying to cause bigger problems. Instead, what the state sees itself as doing is it sees a role for itself as a conciliator, an arbitrator, And it says, bury the hatchet, pay the compensation, and the one who's dead is not coming back. So let's maybe aim for a more peaceful future instead of having bitterness. So some of these are very profound ways of dealing with these things. Obviously, when you have such a system in place, it will lay more emphasis on an ideal behavior, good behavior, future peace and prosperity, rather than punishing somebody or extracting revenge from somebody. So these are certain differences. Of course, these are not set in stone. You can have a lot of variations, and we'll look at a few of these in all these examples to sort of understand where they're coming from. So the Romano-Germanic family, and basically we need to now go back in time. This is a more of a European invention. So there was the Roman period, and it was okay, it had its ups and downs. Well, the Romans were, a bit aggressive, and Caesar and everybody did go around invading large parts of Europe, but they also took with them Roman law. And now it was not a perfect legal system. Of course, you had more rights if you were a Roman vis-a-vis a non-Roman. Maybe you could be referred to as a barbarian simply because you're not of that particular birth line. If you're a foreigner, there were different rules, but there was a lot of commerce and trade also happening in Roman times, and so they had this whole thing under control. You had Pax Romana, you had this Pax, this legal system in place, and it was a well-oiled machinery that produced results. So, as all good things must come to an end, the Roman Empire also slowly started dissolving and disintegrating. It was a slow descent, spiraling down, and finally, well, around 300, 400 AD, you had a situation where the Visigoths finally invaded Rome itself, and well, now this was the end of Rome. So the Huns had been active before, but then the Visigoths and other Germanic tribes really decimated the whole Roman dream. And after that, Rome ceased to exist as an empire. And of course, this was not entirely the case because a small section did manage to migrate under Justinian to Constantinople, modern day Istanbul. And so, there was a bit of a sliver over there. And they tried to carry on with the Roman traditions as best as they could. Now, a couple of things happened in the meantime. Christianity, first of all, and its widespread adoption by erstwhile Roman subjects. Also, well, there was a bit of a Dark Ages period when the Vikings from Scandinavia were going all around, messing up everybody's happiness. And these were the Dark Ages. And of course, one of the most prominent problems that one can already see in those times was the lack of competent courts. You had all these different empires, different kingdoms, different princely states. You had Charlemagne, you had, of course, the attempts to create alliances, but it was a dark time indeed for Europe, and there was a lot of superstition and a lot of emphasis on the supernatural. And of course, peaceful coexistence between different warring parties and sides was the criteria that was of most importance. We did see a bit of trade happening already, and one of the examples of that would be the Baltic trade route and the cities of the Hanseatic League, for example. We also saw Christianity move more eastwards. But the most important aspect is Renaissance, and this was in the 12th and 13th centuries. And this is how Europe really overcame the shackles of the past, because there was now more emphasis on cities and commerce and progress. So the supernatural, the idea of the church and the state, God being everywhere, these were sort of put in the background, and civil order and law were given more prominence. And of course, law became more and more autonomous. It was not dependent on the whims and fancies of the monarch or the pope, for example, or something like that. Instead, reason was the key criteria for determining how life should be led. And so, in this backdrop, this short history tour that I gave you about the system in Europe, you can already see that the time was very ripe for all sorts of new inventions to come into place and new communities and new social orders. And that's when we see the beginnings of the first medieval universities. Of course, some of the very first ones started already in the 10th or 11th centuries in Italy, for example. But we really see a lot of these universities coming out during the Renaissance period, and they had the task cut out for them, which was to create a new idea of justice and social order and the legal system in place. So here were a bunch of researchers spread out in different universities in Europe, and this was the Renaissance medieval period, and they had to draw upon some inspiration. So they looked at the Roman past. You remember, Rome had just been around for maybe a bit less than 1,000 years, and it still had some notable features which were considered to be worthy of appreciation. And so Roman law was adopted. There were already notes and literature on that topic. And so these universities began to look at how Roman legal systems could be recreated and put again in use in the European course of things. Now, already, as you can see here, there were two schools of thought. One was the copycat school, which said, just copy and paste the Roman law, and that's it. End of the story. You don't have to think too much. Don't use your brains. Just copy and paste it. And then there were the others, the post-glossators, for example, who said, no, we need to mix and match. We need to adapt. And of course, what worked 1,500 years ago may not work right now. So things have become more sophisticated. And so we do some cherry picking and take up the best parts of Roman law and leave out what is irrelevant. So that's how Roman law got modernized, and logical propositions were added to the whole process. And of course, sciences played a big role. Remember, this is also the time when you had amazing things happening. For example, the plague, and it really caused a social upheaval. You had a lot of focus on astronomy, medicine. It's no longer the Pope or the church dictating how things should be. And of course, you had scholars and painters, masters, all of these formed a very viable source of interest for the Renaissance period academic who was interested in legal studies. And so all of these universities were training these jurists who found ready employment in the different European kingdoms and the royal princely states that existed. And of course, they tried to get away from local customs as much as possible. Those local customs which could not be avoided, for example, family relations, land law, and inheritance, these continued, but others were sort of overthrown. And then, of course, this work of reason gave rise to this whole new legal system. And so you see over here an interesting mix of how society was rebranding itself to deal with lawlessness, and a new legal system was put in place. The central figure here would be the monarch and the monarchy, and of course, a lot of attempts were made to distance the monarchy from the actual legal process. So the king or the queen would now be a simple administrator. Of course, they had lots of power, but the legal system was being developed so in that sense that it would not be purely dependent on what the king or the queen thought, but rather that there would be a legal procedure in place and a superstructure ecosystem in place. And then, of course, down the line, 17th century and then the 18th century, we already see a lot of profound changes happening. First of all, with these revolutions in France, for example, and the idea that the monarchy is not really, a god's gift to mankind, but rather you could have the legislature, and the legislature could be an excellent monarch. You don't need to have a king or a queen. You can have parliament, and they can work just as well. So the most important aspect of this particular period would be codification, and you can already see that with the Napoleonic codes right from the time of Napoleon, and the attempt to fuse theoretical and of course practical law into one box, as you may say it so. And so of course there was this need for evolution, which could only have happened under two given circumstances. Number one, if the monarch would be an enlightened sovereign, if not a monarch, then a parliament, which was more concerned about the rights of an individual rather than protecting the old system, and the need that they should be in a powerful country, because that would set the whole system in a boil and be the catalyst for this whole legal revolution that was needed in the European context on the continent. And this happened in France, and of course with the revolution and with Napoleon, you see a lot of profound changes which had an impact all across, and this was not just constricted to France, but you see that spreading across in Germany, in parts of Spain. You see that in the Scandinavian region, of course with the Swedish monarchy and their acceptance of parliament. And so you see a lot of these things that took place over there, which you could contrast with the other great Russian power, which would have been Tsarist Russia, and of course you can see in Europe exactly how Western European countries evolved in this point of time compared to Tsarist Russia, which had a much later, metamorphosis, if you could call it so. In fact, it's interesting to know that after Napoleon was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo, then the Russians were briefly in Paris, and they were occupying France, just like many other foreign countries, like the English or the others, or the Prussians, for example. And these Russian officers were very impressed by what they saw in Paris and the liberalism that they saw in France. And of course, they took it back with them to Tsarist Russia, and it was not appreciated by the Tsars at that point of time. But already you can see how this had an impact on thinkers like Tolstoy and others. But of course, I'm digressing here. We're talking more about the Romano-Germanic law system. So you had this amazing period of time when civil codes became more and more academically oriented, and of course, this whole input from legal scholars really went to the next level. And this process has not stopped yet. Now you have, in the 19th and 20th centuries, more and more of these international conventions, and especially you see that in the context of the European Union now. You could say, for example, that legal nationalism is on the decline. Just for example, yesterday there was the news that in Estonia there is some issue regarding freedom of speech versus hate speech. And the European Commission is now trying to make Estonian laws more synchronized with some international obligations that Estonia agreed to in 2008, which could perhaps mean that hate speech may be finally criminalized in the local context. And of course, these are different variations that you see all the time. There are some countries, member states, that adopt and adapt more easily, and then some, fight a lot more. You have seen that, for example, in the context of Poland and Hungary, for example. But what's happening here is that international conventions and comparative law is also playing a huge role in reshaping the Romano-Germanic system of law. So you see the system going on and on. It's a continuous change. It's not like it's happened and that's the end of it. There's a lot of ferment happening, a lot of churning of ideas happening, but purely, again, from an academic, legal point of view, which takes into account legal principles and which takes into account codification and all of these other aspects. So Parliament plays a huge role, of course, in this, and this system has also been exported out of Europe, as you can imagine, because of colonialism. So it has seen itself in Southern American countries, in Asian countries. Japan, for example, was a key adherent of many of these changes. You've seen them also historically in many other countries in Asia and Africa, except those which were colonized by the British, in which case you have the English common law system. So there are certain important aspects to keep in mind. The most important, of course, is the basic distinction between public and private law. So a lot of emphasis is on private law, and the idea is that there should be freedom of trade, and law of obligations is one very important example of this situation here. And so as long as natural rights are guaranteed and there are no abuses of power, then you have this whole concept rolling forward. And of course, the state takes primacy over here, and the divine right of rulers, kings, and queens is no longer the norm. So this is the key criteria for Romano-Germanic systems of law, the emphasis on private law. Another important part that should not be forgotten, in spite of all the other emphasis on commercialization, is this key focus on the legal rule, and that's the fundamental basis for codification, which would be an organized system of general rules. And the idea is that everything should be in a rule book, and all the questions and all the answers should be readily available to the student who reads such a law book. And this would be the underlying purpose of something like the Napoleonic Codes, for example. So a lot of emphasis is also on justice, morality, policy, and the maintenance of the system. And of course, the rules should not be too general, but they should not be too strict. So finding that right balance is, of course, a very, very complicated aspect of the law system, but it's something that the Romano-Germanic system has excelled in. Well, to somebody from a common law system, of course, one of the biggest issues that you see with the civil law system is the overemphasis on codification. So for example, I specialize in intellectual property rights, and there is this area where intellectual property rights and competition law collide. And so you have certain regulations or directives. You'll read about them more in your second and third year studies and your master studies. So, well, if you look at a regulation, there is the transfer of technology block exemption regulation. And it's really nice. It's quite a pleasant document to read, although at one point it does get a little overcomplicated. And then there are the guidelines, which are like 250 pages. It's like crazy. This thing goes over and beyond what something should be. It becomes just too much paperwork, and of course too much emphasis on every possible thing under the sun, which can cause a lot of problems, as you will realize when you study the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union. So I'll leave that fun part for you to explore and discover later on. So what are the main sources of law? Number one would be legislation, of course, and legislation has a hierarchy, as I've told you. The key element that you can already see here would be a written constitution, which, surprise, surprise, does not exist in Great Britain. They don't have a written constitution. How crazy is that? but they've been doing quite well, so shouldn't really be an issue. So written constitution is the key aspect, and of course there are administrative bodies. Uh, Basically, what you have are constitutional rules, and the constitutional rules will say, for example, men and women, everybody is equal. Yeah, equality before the law, equal protection of the law. Then you have treaties which would say, well, we take this a bit further and we also add human rights here. And so, of course, we now have to include maybe other aspects, people who are, bisexual, transsexual, all of these should also have certain rights. Then you would have a code, and this would be, for example, the family code, which would say that a marriage can be between a man and a woman. Now, of course, already you can see how this can be problematic if you're looking at it from a viewpoint of gay marriages or relationships of that nature. And so again, you have explanations to deal with that. Then there are regulations and decrees from an administrative viewpoint, which would be, let's say you are Estonian or Finnish and you have a girlfriend in Asia or a boyfriend in Asia or Africa, and you would like that person to join you. And now you have maybe some administrative directives which stipulate that only a spouse can get a visa. So what happens if it's a boyfriend or a girlfriend? Then maybe they're not included in this sort of a situation. Also, you could have a situation where the law would indicate that you cannot have, you can only adopt a child, but you cannot pay somebody to get pregnant and have your child for you. Now, this could cause situations where you could overcome these problems by maybe going to a foreign jurisdiction and having a baby in the context that the husband and the wife, they put in the sperm and the egg into in the test tube, and it sort of forms an in vitro fertilization, and then the eggs are planted into the gamete, or the real scientific term for that would be maybe the embryo could be then planted into a third party, a woman, who would then give birth to the child. And of course, how would such a situation be dealt with? Would this person who has agreed to take money to be the bearer of the child, would she be a guardian? Would she be a parent? So as you can see over here, from the constitution all the way down to the directives and the administrative decrees, you have this hierarchy that tries to explain every process. And of course, the legislator, the parliamentarians, they don't need to go into detail. They can just say, yes, you can have in vitro fertilization and the state will pay for it. And then what about a gay couple? Would they be entitled to state-sponsored in vitro fertilization? So again, you see, all of these are concepts that deal basically with legislation. And the point I'm trying to make over here is that the legislative process has a hierarchy and different stages, and all of these play a role. Next would be customs, and of course, they do have an impact, just as do decided cases. But you should be very careful about the fact that in Romano-Germanic system of law, a judge is not a legislator. All right, the parliament makes the law, the judge implements the law. So if, for example, the law says that a married couple can only be a man and a woman, naturally born man and woman, you cannot have a judge who would overturn this particular provision. Of course, the judge could state that, hey, the Constitution says that everybody is born equal. So in that case, either you amend the Constitution or you change the marriage law. So again, the judge cannot enact these changes. The judge can only push the matter back to Parliament. Then another important element to keep in mind about judges is that a judge in a civil law system contrasted with the common law system. Yeah, so in a civil law system, the judge is basically this person who has a law degree and is taken into the judicial service right from a very early stage, and then this person grows in the judicial service, and so it's very different from, for example, common law systems where a judge is expected to have worked as a lawyer for 10-15 years before being considered to be eligible for the judiciary. So again, differences to keep in mind. Yes, there are official collections of decided cases, and you see that all the time. The European Union Intellectual Property Office, the European Patent Office, they all have the appellate board, and then they have these case laws. You have the Court of Justice of the European Union, and they keep on coming up with all these case laws. In your European Union studies, you will read about these case laws as well. So now the question that comes up here is, why are case laws relevant? I mean, they shouldn't be, because in a pure civil law system, the legislature provides for everything, and in a common law system, the judiciary comes up with case laws. But you see a lot of mix and match happening, so it's something that you cannot avoid. Then come legal writings, and again, they help to stimulate legislators to act and play a role in the application of enacted laws. So for example, you could have a new medical system in place, stem cell technology, for example, and then you could have legal scholars writing about how these laws can cause disparities or problems because they conflict with other areas. And so based on that, you have the law then being reconsidered by Parliament. So, and lastly, of course, there are super eminent principles, which are based very often on your legal maxims in Latin, and in some universities, they have a full course just on legal maxims and legal phrases. So you spend an entire term reading every possible legal phrase. Volunti no fit injuria. If you make a mess yourself, then you are responsible for it. Or you have others like fraud taints everything. No one can contradict his own deed. These are all these fancy Latin phrases which have a very deep meaning, but of course, they have to be emphasized upon, and you have to be very careful about them. So this sort of covers the civil law system, and this is, of course, the Romano-Germanic family. And next time I will look at the common law system, and then hopefully you can see the difference between the two. I'm very sorry, because of this coronavirus situation, we don't have the possibility to invite guest lecturers. In the past, we have had some very interesting guest lecturers from Germany, from the United States, from Great Britain, and it's always been a pleasure to interact with them, and they have been very happy to explore and explain their different legal systems. And so, well, yeah, this year is just you and me. So, well, we try to make the best of this situation. All right. So thank you for your time. And then, of course, remember, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me by email or in Moodle. We also have a chat forum possibility in Moodle, so we can have questions about that. And hopefully, let's try to keep our heads together down in September, and October will come up with better news. So until then, take care and goodbye.